Thanks for joining us today. I have to say I've learned a lot already on the previous panels and on the speeches in particular. Really inspiring speech actually from the president of Chile, as we heard. So we were basically speaking about the urgency about acting on climate, really. And I think this was highly eloquently illustrated by the keynotes in the first part of the event. And at the second panel, we've basically tried to make more sense of where to channel and how to channel investments into this low carbon future, or I should rather say zero carbon future. This panel now is where we want to understand if it's technically possible and how long it would actually take to really move our energy sectors to the renewable energy transition or accelerate the renewable energy transition, but also is there anything else that we have to do to really be in line with the benchmark of 2 degrees as it was elaborated in the Paris Agreement. And I have to say I'm really excited about this panel, and I'm just going to introduce you quickly the different panelists. I think it's a fantastic panel. I'm not sure if it was ever in this combination happening, so I really look forward to this. And I ask first Steve Sawyer to join us on the stage. Steve is basically was the first Secretary General of the Global Wind Energy Council, which is the go-to place for renewable energy development and understanding the renewable energy development. And he's now a senior policy advisor for the Global Wind Energy Council. Secondly, I would like to ask Carl to join the panel. Carl is the Director Innovation, Media and Technology of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. Then we have Sven Teske, who is the Research Director of the Institute for Sustainable Futures of the University of Sydney, ISF. Great to have you here, Sven. And then I would like to ask Mika to join us on the panel. Mika is the director of the Renewable Energy Institute in Japan, and one of the very strong advocates for renewables globally, but also especially in Japan, of course. And last but not least, I would like to ask Juan Carlos Villalonga to join the panel, who is the congressman from Argentina. I think many of you know him very well. He's one of the most committed environmentalists for many years in the country of Argentina. So this is really, really a fascinating panel. Thanks for joining us. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Steve to start us off to understand if the energy transformation is actually doable and where we are. Steve.
Hello. Yes, this thing is on, so I won't take your microphone. Can I have my presentation, please? There we go. I've been working on energy and environments and renewables for about 40 years, and with a main focus on the climate issue for the last 30 years. And when the climate issue first got going, it was my impression that most of the conversation would in fact be about energy. Much to my surprise, virtually none of the conversation in the climate negotiations is about energy, except where certain vested interests trying to bring in so-called clean coal or revitalize nuclear power or various other things. And likewise, in the energy business, you would think that an awful lot of the conversation would be about climate change. And I continue to be shocked by the extent to which climate change is not considered one of the major parameters for system optimization, even in a 100% renewable energy future. So I figured this gathering was a good opportunity to try to bring those worlds a little bit closer together and at least get them talking the same language if they cannot talk to each other. So I'm going to provide a little bit of background which will hopefully facilitate that. Just the quick paid political advertisement for the Global Wind Energy Council. We're a trade association that represents the major companies as well as associations in the sector globally. And our mission is to represent the sector with intergovernmental institutions, but most importantly, to open up new markets for the industry, where Argentina has been an important focus for the last 2 or 3 years now. 2017 was another extraordinary year for renewables. I'm not going to ask you to memorize these numbers, but just keep in mind that 70% of the new power capacity added globally last year was renewables, and about 2/3, a little bit more than 2/3 of the total investment. But we still have a very, very long way to go if you measure it in terms of final energy consumption. With modern renewables, we're at about 4% of total primary energy consumption, or final energy consumption, as you will, and the vast majority of which is still dominated by fossil fuels. We are lagging behind, particularly in the heat sector. That number is deceptive because it includes traditional biomass, which still plays a major role in many parts of the developing world. Some of that may be sustainable, but mostly it is not. And so there's been a gradual shift from the use of sustainable biomass in heating and in electricity generation. And the non-sustainable traditional biomass is shrinking, but not fast enough. Transport is the big empty spot at the moment for renewables, but we've all been reading about the electric car revolution, as well as electric airplanes and electric ships, which are beginning to appear now. So there's a lot of hope there, but we're starting from an extremely low base. 3% of the energy in transport is renewables. I'm going to talk mostly about the power sector. It's where we've had the biggest breakthroughs in the course of the last few years. We're up to 25% now of all global power coming from renewable energy, and that number is set to rise extraordinarily. And as I say repeatedly over and over again, if there's any chance of meeting either of the Paris targets, then we need 100% emissions-free electricity sector well before 2050. The good news is that we have the technology to do it now, and it's cheaper than any other alternative. These are the gross numbers in terms of installations. You may have read that Bloomberg put out a note a few months ago saying that the combined total installed capacity of wind and solar is now up to 1 terawatt, or 1,000 gigawatts, or 100,000 megawatts, whatever, if any of those numbers mean anything to you. And it amounts to 8-9% of total global electricity installed capacity. And there's where we are more in detail in the power sector. The numbers don't exactly match with the previous chart for reasons which all of these metrics are imperfect, whether you're talking about total final energy consumption, primary energy demand, primary energy production, etc., but they're within the ballpark. And we see wind now at more than 5.5% of global electricity supply last year. Solar coming on very strong at almost 2%. It's the fastest growing technology right now. Biopower up there. And for the first time, we have significant bumps coming from ocean energy and concentrating solar power, which have been technologies which we've been waiting for to make a difference for a long, long time. The good news is that in virtually every place on Earth now, the cheapest way to install new capacity, generating capacity on the grid, is either wind or solar or both. And that has been the case now in most geographies for quite some years, and I think you can just about say that almost universally everywhere. Now, the prices will vary dramatically depending upon the framework conditions and the financing conditions and whatever. But here, I think you see here in Argentina that the prices that have come through in the tenders for wind and solar over the last couple of years are about half of what they are for conventional generation. And there was a tender in Brazil just last week where wind power came in at the equivalent of about 2 US cents per kilowatt hour. And they reserved a special place for a thermal power plant in there, which was about 3 times as much as that, simply because somebody thought they wanted or needed a thermal power plant for something, a small one. Nobody can actually say why. But to the list of onshore wind and solar PV, we can now add offshore wind. With a developed supply chain in Europe, it's directly competitive on the wholesale power markets in an increasing number of markets. And as I mentioned before, concentrating solar power is making progress. So now that we can supply power and energy with renewables cheaper than through any other source, there's a few things that we need to do. One is to figure out how to broaden the role of electricity in the energy sector. This is one of my favorite charts from the Energinet in Denmark, which is trying to make use of their tremendous wind resources and other renewable resources to increase the role of electricity in transport, in heating in particular, but also in terms of industry and in the oil and gas sectors. And that's, along with this sort of general chart, you'll see the total primary energy consumption come down, the energy services delivered increased, and a much higher percentage of that will come from electricity. And I think that's the key message today, that electrification is the future if we're going to have any chance to getting to any of the Paris goals. I think now that wind and solar in particular and other technologies are so cheap that the critical question becomes not if you choose one or the other, but how you combine them to optimize the system. And as I mentioned at the outset, the primary goal, from our perspective anyway, is that the main parameter for system optimization is zero emissions. And if you don't take that as a given, we're going to have a problem, because the global community and most national communities have failed almost completely in internalizing the external costs of CO2 emissions in any meaningful way. So unless you build it into the system optimization, I don't really see how you get there, but we're going to discuss that a bit. The rate of change, both in the technology and in the sophistication of the electricity systems in the countries that are adopting this, is moving very, very dramatically. And such that if you describe the current situation to me 10 years ago, I'd said you were crazy and over-optimistic. I hope and expect that to continue to be the case. The transformation is happening at all the scales, particularly as we see offshore wind becoming competitive. You see pan-national interconnections making a much larger difference, particularly in Europe, but moving very quickly in China, in Taiwan, and it will be elsewhere as well, medium scale. With the hybrids, there's very exciting projects happen where you combine a wind farm with a solar PV plant and a small amount of storage, and there's one called the Kennedy Wind Farm in Australia, where they're doing that now and getting an 84% capacity factor and delivering electricity at considerably less than the cost of either new gas or coal. The problems that we need to focus on, I think, to get us where we need to go are four: steel production, cement production, ships, and planes. Now, we don't have time for a technical discussion on how we could move on those issues, but it's not so much the heat associated with those, but it's the process emissions in steel from coking coal and from all the CO2 that gets released in the building of cement. We have the technology to make those things without the process emissions, but we do not yet have the incentives to do so, and they're still too expensive. Ships and planes, it should be obvious, there are technological solutions, both existing and under development. Norway has now set a goal of 2030 to have all of its domestic flights be battery powered, but I think it's going to be a long time before we get on a 747 to fly across the Atlantic on batteries. So we need another answer for that, and one of those might be hydrogen/ammonia, or it could be biofuels. Biofuels are complex for a large variety of reasons. Whoops, too quickly. I don't have any more time left. The renewables industries as a whole is quite optimistic because under a purely economically driven scenario, and there have been a number of these created over the last 2-3 years, we dominate the global power sector by 2050. Business case is very good virtually across the board, but it's not fast enough to save the climate. And that's really what we need to figure out how to change. The old drivers that we talk about are the campaigns to shut down old coal power plants that have been very successful in the United States, have some traction in Europe, Price on carbon, we've tried that, it didn't work. We still try. Hopefully one day it will work somewhere. It would be nice. Subsidy removal, we talked about it in the previous panel. The fossil fuel industry is still subsidized by governments to, on the most conservative estimates, about $600 billion a year. The IMF, if you include externalities, calls it more like $6 trillion. We've been working on that, well, somebody's been working on that since 1947, when the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs was signed. They haven't made much progress. So we need some new drivers. We've got consumers, we've got the corporate purchasing. It's beginning to make a difference, national and regional targets, and it would be good to have something useful out of Paris, but none of the conversation since Paris about the implementation on it has had any effect on the energy business, anywhere that I'm aware of. Hopefully that will change. So just to wrap up, I think the main message is that we have the technology. 30 years ago when we started on the climate issue, we didn't have the technology. We did a fossil fuel-free energy scenario in 1991 where the only way that we could actually come up with something that worked was basically to transform most of the world's forests into biomass plantations. We didn't have a solar industry. We didn't have a wind industry. We didn't have any of those things. Now we do, but we have to use it. We need to make it work together, and we need to do it very quickly. Again, focus on these main problem areas for R&D development. I'm sure they can be cracked. The power sector, as we know it in OECD countries, in many other countries, is changing beyond all recognition very, very quickly. As the digitization of the sector increases, and with the role of artificial intelligence, it's going to increase even quicker. And that hopefully is a good thing. It would be nice if we could come up with a rational plan, an orderly plan, to get from where we are to where we need to go. Unfortunately, that's not the way human history usually works. So it's going to come in leaps and jumps and starts, but hopefully we can work together and make it happen. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve. That was excellent. Can we get the next presentation uploaded, please? I think one of the key messages that you shared with us is that sometimes, when we hear about what, the recent data, the recent development of climate change, I don't know how you feel, but I sometimes feel, okay, it's so difficult, and we probably won't make it. And the 2 degrees target sometimes, not target, the 2 degrees benchmark sometimes seems to be sort of too ambitious. So what are we going to do? And I think the key message here is really, this is already happening. Did you hear that number? 2/3 of all investments into new generation technologies went into renewables this year. So this is actually really...
Who's investing the other third and why?
Yeah. Who's investing the other third and why? That's a good question. We probably will come to that here. But I just want to draw your attention to another fact. The Paris Agreement, the 2 degrees benchmark, clearly means we have to speed up the development of the energy transition. Is this enough? Probably not, because we still have a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. So what we also need to do is simultaneously increase the Earth's capacity, basically, if you like, to absorb CO2, trees, soils. And in order to really get a clear picture what this would entail, I would like to draw your attention to Karl Burkhardt's presentation, who's working on a scenario together with Sven, who will follow up, Karl, and on exactly that question. How do we really meet this goal? Karl, over to you.
You are walking with them. Okay.
Hi, everybody. Buenos dias. What's that? My name is Karl. I'm the Director of Media and Technology for the DiCaprio Foundation. Let's see. Do we have a slideshow up? Oh, that's me.
It's you.
So you'll see shortly. Here we go. I can click it. Yes, that's my boss. Just to clarify, the DiCaprio. He's much more interesting than me, so I apologize for not being as exciting, but I'll do my best. And we want to really... we wanted to thank F20 and the vision of Klaus. We feel like, the foundations are about to have a new moment. And the foundation's been polite and quiet and secretly from behind, but I think our day is coming to really be public and become advocates for change. Leo actually started his foundation 20 years ago, which is kind of amazing as a young man, and it's been growing really rapidly. I can't say officially, but next week we'll be making an announcement. Don't tweet it, but we're hitting our $100 million mark of grant making just in the past 8 years. So we've gone on this radical journey to get money out the door. A lot of that has been focused on conservation. So that was Leonardo's original interest, protecting oceans and lands and biodiversity. And but he took on the Messenger of Peace title with the UN a few years ago, and that was a picture of him from the Climate Leaders Summit in 2014. And with that, we started bringing on a climate program, focusing especially on renewable energy. But for us, we see these two, biodiversity and energy, as intertwined, and we'll explain that in a second. So while we've been building up our grant-making operation, we've also been building a media operation, and one of my parts of my job is managing 60 million people that we talk to every day through Leo's channels. And most of those people are young. I would say, most of them are girls. I will admit that. There's a lot of young women, very smart people. When this film came out, I don't know if you saw it, Before the Flood was our feature documentary on climate change. It was a good film. If you saw it, it was very gloomy, I would say. It was a little depressing. But it was successful. We had 100 million views and 1 billion media impressions. And just in the past year, we've had 4 billion media impressions on our channels. But almost all of that conversation about this film was like, stop talking about the problem. We know climate change is real. We get it. We learned this in school. These are people who are in their 20s. And they're like, tell us what to do. What's the vision? What's the plan? So when we saw this feedback after Leo's movie, we started asking everybody who's got the plan to save the planet. And we didn't really find one, actually. So in early 2017, we launched a new project called One Earth, which was a science program to answer all the questions all of the young people around the world were asking us, and we realized we didn't have really cogent, succinct answers for. And so that included a round of 20 grants. They're all very exciting projects, and you'll hear about some of the fruits of that from Sven, who is one of our grantees at University of Technology, Sydney, doing some very interesting energy modeling work. So I've always been told I should make my comments really short and clear. So there are 3 key findings that we came out of our science program. Bad news and good news. The bad part of it is that the climate change is so much worse than we thought, actually. And there's been a big round of papers in the last 2 years that are changing the way we think about impacts, the severity, the frequency, and also just data, gaps in data. For example, all of the coastal elevation data in the tropics more or less is inaccurate. So we know now 4 times the people will be impacted by sea level rise, as an example. So anyway, so it's bad, but the good news is we'll actually be okay if we stay near 1.5 C in global temperature rise. And that may sound hard, but actually we can do it, and we don't need magical technologies or solutions. We have shovel-ready solutions right now. I'm not going to dwell on the Paris Agreement. It's a good start. But the 2 degrees C, I keep hearing it, and all my talks now, I just feel like I have to make a plug to just let's abandon the 2 degrees C. We shouldn't even talk about it. I mean, at least now Paris is moving to well below 2C, but we don't want to be anywhere near 2C. I mean, it means basically 2C is the apocalypse, according to a lot of the latest research, including 1/4 of agricultural lands collapsing, all the coral reefs collapsing, meter of sea level rise, 100 million refugees. So that's 20 Syrias happening simultaneously on the planet. We don't want that. So the good news is there's been a lot of modeling, and I'm going to wrap up. I think I'm out of time, but this is a great paper if you're interested on 1.5 C models. So it used to be a very rare model that would come out with a solid 1.5 scenario. So Rogelj et al., I recommend people, this is about 24 1.5 models. They all have one thing in common, which you can see that black line in the middle is 0 emissions. All of the 1.5 models go below that in the second half of the century. So that's negative emissions. So that means sucking. So in addition to doing 100% renewables, which we have to do and we're huge supporters of, we also have to suck out carbon from the atmosphere. That's called negative emissions. Most of these models use something called BECCS, which is bioenergy and carbon capture. We don't think that's viable. But the good news is there are really amazing viable solutions. Boy, I wanted to show more, but maybe, yeah. Well, how about I just jump to this? Is there a way to press play on the little video? Oh, this is a short one. It's okay. We just funded a really interesting scenario, a rendering of all the world's carbon sinks, that's a still from it. We have a video rendering of it. If anyone asks me, I can email it to you. But really that green blob you're seeing there, and it's on the other side, you can't see the other side, but that's the carbon sink that we have that's working right now. And a big part of our strategy is to really bolster that carbon sink by protecting it and also restoring it. And this map is an amazing paper out last year, Herb et al. The red zones that you see is ability for the soils and biomass to increase. So the Earth is hungry for more carbon. We've got a lot of carbon in the air. So part of what we're working on is how do we get the carbon out of the air back into the soils. And so this is an initial project. It's half blank because I just got the data yesterday. But we're looking at 14 different solutions in the land use sector to really do that. And I won't go into details, but it's everything from reforestation to managing our plantation forests better to improving grazing and croplands, and also restoring degraded croplands and putting it back into productivity. So with all of that, we're very confident there's about 700 gigatons of potential, 700 billion tons that we could remove. A lot of that is probably too expensive to do, but a whole lot of that is actually very cheap, some under $50 a ton. And that doesn't even include all the co-benefits that you get with it, which would be better water, less soil erosion, better food productivity, and so forth. So we're very excited, and as I said, we're looking at biodiversity and also soils and also energy kind of together. And with that, we can do 1.5. And I'm going to hand it off to Sven now to talk about the energy portion of this model.
Thanks, Carl. While I'm waiting for my presentation to come up, basically we received finance from the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation to do exactly that, to come up with an energy plan. So I see myself as sort of the chief engineer on that ship to actually power it towards a 1.5 degree future. And we teamed up with 2 other institutions. My own institution is the University of Technology, Sydney, the Institute for Sustainable Futures. We have a team of engineers and social scientists working on that. Then we work with the German Aerospace Center. As you probably hear from my accent, I'm not really Australian, even though I live there. I'm German. So we work with a German aerospace center on the energy modeling, and with the University of Melbourne for the non-energy gas emission models. And we have, and I think that's quite innovative and one of the first times ever that we actually interact with each other quite closely. So the task is basically to come up with a standard energy model. We take the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook as basically our reference case. We take the parameters, the statistics and everything from that publication, because it's the publication which is most widely used for the energy debate. And we basically take that to model a very alternative future. And we basically model not just what the International Energy Agency does, which turns out to be a 4 or 5 degree scenario right now. We add a 2 degree scenario, which I personally think we are actually in a very good sort of direction to go in this 2 degree scenario. And then we add a 1.5 degree scenario, which is challenging and which actually needs sometimes just other solutions. So the methodology, and to be very, very short and sharp, step 1 is we define the carbon budget. So how much carbon in gigatons we actually have in total. And that's sort of the first challenge, under what circumstances. So the colleagues from the University of Melbourne gave us a number, and we say, okay, that's basically our budget, so we try to stay in that budget. Step 2 for us is we do an analysis of the renewable energy potential in the available area, because we can't just cover the whole planet with solar panels, obviously. So we basically just have to see what are the land uses, where can we actually build new solar and wind on the utility scale, and what will be the output. Then we have a long-term scenario, which goes in 5-year steps, from current situation until 2050, where we have 0 carbon in 1.5 degrees. And then we take the electricity part from that long-term scenario and make a bottom-up, which is quite new, a bottom-up scenario in terms of the demand, how the households will develop, especially in developing countries. So we model that the developing countries will have within the next 10, 20 or 30 years, depending on where they start, to have the same standard as OECD country households, to come up with a demand, and at the same time suggest a load curve for the industry and for the household. So we come up with a load curve for altogether roughly 80 sub-regions, and then we take the solar and wind potential and there is data, weather data available in 1 hour steps, and to model to match supply and demand with very high penetration solar and wind electricity systems. And step 5, we work with 2 other clients on resource requirement. That means how many cobalt, how many copper, how many rare earth do we actually need for that? And what is the just transition? What are the basically the workers who actually right now are involved in fossil fuels? What are the options to transit from the current fossil fuel sector towards the renewable energy sector? And that's another project, and it's all in parallel. That means really busy, but we're going to be ready by the end of this year for the COP. And I'm happy to show you just a glimpse of first results. This is obviously, this is sort of one first step, is we map Africa, and we basically divide Africa into 8 different regions, and every of those 8 regions will get a specific scenario in 1 hour steps. Then we check the infrastructure. So we see in all regions where are currently the power plants, where are currently transmission lines, and, very important, where do the people actually live, the population density. So we see where's the electricity grid, where are the power plants, where are the people. That sounds simple, but especially in Africa, that actually does not match. Quite often you have power plants which actually just supply the industry there, and the power line goes over the head of that village, but they don't have electricity. So that's very important. And then the next step is to, that's me playing around with PowerPoint animation, doesn't work. Then we have the wind potential. We basically map the wind potential. But you see, usually the wind maps are sort of light blue to dark blue, and usually dark blue and red is the best area. What we do is a bit different. We basically subtract all the areas which are covered by agricultural land to a large extent, by nature conservation areas, obviously by cities, because you can't put a wind turbine in the city, stuff like that. And we basically have then a number, how many megawatts or gigawatts we can install in each of those clusters. And then, as a next step, we basically develop a scenario. That's sort of the first preliminary results. And we see how many gigawatts we actually have in solar and wind and all the other technologies, and what's the potential, and basically exceeding do we exceed the potential? And we actually, for the 2-degree scenario, we are usually around like 1 or 5% of the potential we have. There are some stand out, especially in the wind sector, where we use 20 or even more %, but that's due to space limitations. And then we bring this together, and this is, for example, one of the long-term scenario that's for China, and that's for me a very important message. It is not the question, what is more important? What are the low-hanging fruits in terms of, is it energy efficiency or is it renewables? It's actually both at the same time. And low-hanging fruits, that was a really interesting debate in the 80s, but could we please stop that? We actually have to earn and harvest the entire tree, basically, all the fruits, and actually put it together. And this is, for example, for China. China is actually on a very good way in terms of installing a lot solar and wind, but on the same time, China installed about 90 or 85% of all new coal power plants. And that means if you accept a generation time for about 40 years for coal power plants, it's not going to work. So they have to operate shorter. So this is sort of an example how a long-term scenario or 3 scenarios look like. And then we zoom in and say, what's the change? How many solar photovoltaic and onshore wind, offshore wind we actually have to build every year? And we actually also have to discuss that, and that's why we discuss it, for example, with Steve from the Global Wind Energy Council, but also with the solar industry. Could you actually deliver that in that time? Because it would be really embarrassing if we say, you need to build 10 gigawatts, and the solar industry says, sorry, we can only build 1. So we actually talk while we do this with the industry and say, can you deliver that in that time frame? And that's the time frame is the problem. And then we have a system analysis where I just wanted to give you a glimpse. The black bar is how, like, they call baseload power plants, like how baseload power plants operate right now. And then you see the black bar is shrinking. And that means if you have a high penetration system, solar and wind, you will have no baseload power plants. Baseload is not a technical concept. It is an economic concept. It basically says that you have a guarantee to produce and to sell. I would compare it to a factory for shoes. If your shoe factory has a capacity of manufacturing 1,000 shoes a year, you're not guaranteed that you actually sell 990s a year. But a coal power plant wants to have that guarantee that they sell everything they can do. They will not get that guarantee anymore, and that means the market framework for renewables or for the electricity market will change tremendously. We will have to have a new framework which takes into account that reacting, being quick, is actually more valid than just generating something. It's not bad, it's just different, and that we need to actually take that into account. We come up with load curves for all the regions. You see that big green bar sticking up, and that's basically Africa. Africa will have a 5 times more load in only 30 years than now. And that means the infrastructure needs to change, and needs to change according to the scenario. I close with this. This is a first result of our resource assessment. This is the amount of lithium need for batteries for the electric vehicles. And we have different scenarios. The blue one would be no recycling, nothing. But if we recycle the equipment, the material, then we can actually have a curve which can increase slower in order to not just increase the mining capacity and then decrease it after a while again, but just have a slow increase of the mining capacity for lithium. And it also means that countries, or the geopolitical importance of countries changes because we need certain elements for that technology. And for example, lithium put Chile absolutely on the map, on the very, very important resource country, because lithium is there. And to close, what are the challenges for the 100% renewables scenario? I start with what's not the problem. The renewables potential, we can tick that box. Technology readiness, we can tick that box. Costs, as Steve just presented, we can tick that box. What are the challenges? It's time. Because we don't have much time. We have that small budget. And every year, we don't do anything. We emit 35 or 40 gigatons, which eats from our budget. Secondly, transformation of the infrastructure. That's the challenge. To transform gas pipelines towards hydrogen pipelines, to transform electricity grids to be flexible. And that's basically a challenge. And transforming the workforce. We cannot transform sort of on the back of workers. We basically have to do the transformation with the workers. What are the barriers? Short-sighted policies. Like in my new home country, the politicians debate energy policy on a weekly level. And I have to say, energy policy, in that regard, it would be actually much better if the politicians of Australia basically say, we guarantee we not talk about energy the next 2 years. That would be great, because that would give some time to actually develop something. Then we have uninformed politicians. They say, solar panels need more energy than we use for production. That's not true since the 1970s. And required, and I close with that, education, research and development. We need more community and social engagement. We need to enforce the communities and social society to actually build this and to enable them both in terms of gender and the global south. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sven. This was really excellent. And you said one of the barriers is sort of uninformed politicians. And this is exactly the stuff why you should be aware that this is actually leading to political leadership. Because if people know what actually is the impact of their decisions, they are more willing and more easily taking those decisions of 100% target, for example. So this is exactly the stuff we need. I should add, and to give tribute to Sven's work, Sven is doing this work for more than 2 decades. And sometimes it's good to look back. Who was right in scenarios and modeling, and who was wrong? And there's actually one scenario stream, I would say, who really got the numbers right, and that was Sven's scenarios. So we really appreciate the work that you're doing. And now we're moving to Japan and to Mika, because certainly this is also, F20 really tries to contribute to the G20 discourse. And the question is, of course, how can this be translated by the heads of states, by the G20 countries? I'd like to give the floor to Mika, who can much better judge the situation in the next hosting country of the G20, which is Japan. And of course, what the renewable energy roadmap could play in the context of the G20 in Osaka. Mika, thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. I came here to explain that what's the real situation of Japanese energy transition, which is the next host of the G20 country. I think that this is the last slide. This is the last slide. Yeah. Can you start from the beginning? Yeah, actually, since I came here, I was thinking about to present the different things, but I decided to present some devastated photos from the beginning. Okay, so this is Japan. Japan is a nation with many disasters. This is just 2 months ago in the kind of I'm not so good at working with some slides and then this one, and then this is Kyoto 2 days ago, that it was hit by typhoon, and then so many the historic buildings are hit by this typhoon, just 2 days ago. And then this is yesterday, that at 9 hours ago in Hokkaido, the north part of Japan. So the huge landslides in mountains, and also the kind of a liquefaction occurred in town. and blackouts of whole island. So Hokkaido is one of the biggest island in Japan, but the whole blackouts. Because of that, they relied on one big coal-fired power plant. And then coal-fired plant that hit by the earthquake, and it's broken, and then it led the shutdown of all other power plants. So this is a kind of a solution that we found that just after 7 years of Fukushima accident, that it's totally remind me that 7 years ago we were hit by the earthquake and big tsunami and the nuclear power plants damaged. So that is the reason why our institute was born. That we just born that after Fukushima accident in April 2011. Our owner is the Masayoshi Son. He is one of the billionaires in Japan that has the SoftBank group. So he decided to focus on renewable energy expansion in Japan. And then that he created the renewable energy company, and also he donated his private money, pocket money, to create our organization. And we focus on just a kind of a renewable energy policy studies to create the renewable-based society in Japan. So this is a kind of a comparison of global expansion of renewables and Japan. So the global PV expansion reached 400 gigawatt already. That's a huge kind of a growth. And then you could see that Japan is nearly reaching 50 gigawatt. That I think that it's really doing well, that more than 10% of the world. And this is wind power. So the world reached about the 540 gigawatt, and Japan is it's very small percentage, like a 3.4 gigawatt of wind power only Japan has. As I said, 50 gigawatt of solar PV we have, but for wind, we only have 3.4 gigawatt. It's because of the mixture of the kind of a wrong policies implementation. Whenever the solar wind industry tried to grow, that the Japanese government introduced a different policy to the sector, and then the industry just cannot grow. And then this is the Japan installed capacity of energies that from 2010 to 2017, you can see the huge expansion of solar power. Like kind of we just grow like a 45 gigawatt of solar after 2011. And then this is just a comparison of capacity. You could see the kind of the rightest bar is the energy saving and energy efficiency. Sven said, like, so we need both renewable energy expansion and then renewable this energy saving and energy efficiency. So that we did for that kind of after we lost about the 30% of electricity produced by nuclear power. And it reads like this, that after the implementation of feed-in tariff in Japan, that the solar power especially, that it grows, and also the generation cost of renewables are declining according to the expansion of renewables. And this leads the CO2 emission in Japan reduction. People usually say that Japan increased the CO2 emission because that we stopped the 45 nuclear power plant at once in 2011. And then until now that we only have 4 reactors are working in Japan, but the CO2 emissions are declining because of the expansion of renewables and then due to the energy saving and energy efficiency. So we can do this. But if you see the comparison of LCOE of different energy sources with different countries, Japan's cost is quite high compared to other countries. You can see the blue bar is wind and orange bar is the solar. So the pricing bar is totally very varied, and then that you could see that Japanese kind of a last runner of solar price is very high. So Japan is a very expensive country in terms of renewable energies, but you also can see the top runner of solar is reaching for the kind of a lowest cost of fossil fuel. So Japan is doing well in that sense, but we have to decrease this kind of a range of huge birds. So that is one of the barriers in Japan. And another barrier is, so this is the kind of a government decided to the 2030, the electricity mix, that it was adopted 4 years ago, and then this year that the government again adopted the same target for 2030. So in 2030, the renewable just accounted for 22 to 24%. But the nuclear has to account for 20 to 22%, but the currently nuclear is around 1 to 2%, so nobody believes that it will reach 20 to 22% by 2030. But if you try to adjust the number of renewables, which is expanding, then you have to touch upon the nuclear target. So the government just avoid to touch upon that target. And then that, of course, that you have to see the core target for Japan is 26%. So it's huge, actually. And then this is a kind of additional new coal-fired power plant that the companies, including incumbent utilities, are planning to add in the country. But still, this is the 33 projects and the 17 gigawatt, but it is little bit declining since they announced the project, because that the Japanese companies and utilities just aware that introducing such kind of huge amount of coal-fired power plant will be the kind of a stranded asset for them, because renewables are expanding and also they see the trend that globally. But on the other hand, this is the kind of utilities electricity demand, incumbent utilities electricity demand and generation. From 2010 to 2016, you could see almost of the 90% of their electricity generation is coming from fossil fuel. And then hydro is about 10%. But they have to change this. So incumbent utilities has not invested in the renewable energies. So the investors for renewable energies are from other sector. But in Japan, that somehow the changes are happening. In the southern part and then west part of Japan, there is a day that more than 100% is supplied by renewables, the Kyushu and Shikoku. So the changes are happening. Actually, and also that so many companies, except the energy industry, that they tried to commit to the climate change initiative. For example, this is the one of the network that we created, that the 1 month ago, Japan Climate Initiative, that now the 200 companies, including Hitachi, SoftBank, and Aeon, or big companies joined to commit to the climate change mitigation, and they want to declare the pledge that they will go for for example, 100 renewables by 2040, or those kind of initiative that they declared. So I think that those kind of non-state actors approach could work in Japan, and then with this kind of a network that we tried to push the national government to pull out their ambitions for the 2050. So this is this year, 2018, that Japan has not announced its long-term target, that they are still negotiating. But for 2019, when they host the G20, that they have to announce that ambitious goal for 2050. So I think that this is their goal that we have to go, and then we do not come back to the past. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Thank you, Mika. Thank you very much. for these insights. And it seems, if I'm not mistaken, I hear actually some more optimistic thoughts from you with regard to the G20 and the role that Japan will play to really develop this renewable energy transition, at least to a certain extent. So we will be very curious, of course, to see that. Some of us will most probably also involved in the G20 context next year. Certainly F20 will be. So now I think we should sort of come back to Argentina from our journey from the global perspective over to Japan now to Argentina. Before I give you the floor, Kali, I just want to encourage you to think about questions. And we have this little chair there. It's a little bit of an experiment for us as well, that we ask you to join the share and ask your question. But please do that, because we want to have really an interactive debate here. So prepare, equip yourself with the questions that may have occurred here, and then just after the intervention from Kali and maybe one or two questions from my end, we will have the opportunity for you to raise a few questions. So back to Argentina, just a couple of months, and then you will be heading the G20. Is it going to make some positive decisions with regard to the energy transformation?
Bien.
Kali, over to you.
Bueno, gracias, buen día. Yo no tengo presentación, no me habían avisado, así que podemos poner la de Leonardo DiCaprio y Bueno, yo creo que a mí me toca la parte de representar la política, o por lo menos hablar de la política. Como Sven dijo, somos parte de las barreras. Y ciertamente allí hay barreras. Yo recuerdo que Steve estuvo hace 2 años aquí en la Argentina y dijo, la política o los políticos no tienen la menor idea de lo que firmaron en París. Y la verdad, algo de eso ocurre. Si bien hubo grandes avances, incluso aquí en la Argentina, todavía estamos muy, muy lejos de tener una política que esté a la altura de los escenarios que estamos viendo, y yo diría del desafío que tenemos por delante. A ver, para entender lo que pasa en la Argentina, pero yo creo que se replica prácticamente en todos nuestros países, Argentina tiene una matriz energética que depende del 87% de hidrocarburos, ¿sí? El 87% de toda la energía del país proviene de hidrocarburos. Esto habla de la dimensión del desafío, y tanto de la urgencia por los 30 años que tenemos, si tomamos de aquí al 2050, nos da una idea del tiempo escaso que tenemos para producir esta transformación y la magnitud que eso significa. En la política, la competitividad de las renovables se ve como una gran oportunidad, es cierto, y muchos ya hemos avanzado de manera significativa con las renovables, pero todavía esto está visto como una oportunidad para diversificar la matriz energética. Yo odio la palabra diversificar la matriz energética, porque eso es que todos los lobbies tengan algo. Y la verdad que, por lo que estamos hablando, la matriz energética hay que cambiarla radicalmente, hay que, yo digo, dar la vuelta como una media. Eso es lo que hay que hacer. La política en general, cuando digo la política con todas sus excepciones, digo, en general la dirigencia política le cuesta muchísimo asumir lo que significa la transición. Creo que este es uno de los grandes desafíos que tenemos para comunicar y para trasladar a los decisores. Entender que la transición significa abandonar completamente los hidrocarburos, abandonar la era del petróleo en poco más de 3 décadas. Después vuelo sobre eso por lo que significa en términos de transición. En la Argentina, a los que están aquí en la Argentina lo saben, a partir del año 2016 comenzó a haber un programa de desarrollo de renovables exitoso. Fue la primera vez que hubo decisión política de impulsar las renovables. Si bien no nos faltó instrumentos legales, es decir, hubo normativa, desde la década del 90 tuvimos leyes, pero no tuvimos nunca una vocación para desarrollarlas y digamos, con contundencia. A partir del 2016 se empezaron a hacer las licitaciones, que es un poco el modelo que hoy en el mundo está siendo más exitoso para impulsar las renovables. Y entre el 2016 y 2017 se firmaron contratos por 6.900 megawatts, 5.900 megawatts de potencia. Eso entre las dos rondas del 2016-2017 más algunos otros contratos. Realmente muchísimos, si pensamos las ofertas que hubo fueron muchísimo más grandes. Si a eso le agregamos lo que está pasando en los últimos meses, que ya comienza a ver lo que se llama el mercado entre privados, es decir, desarrolladores de proyectos y usuarios de energía, sumamos otros 1.000 megas. O sea que estamos en los 6.000 megas en contratos. Imagínense que ya esos proyectos ahora están comenzando a conectarse a la red, se empiezan a inaugurar. Estamos en un promedio de que va a haber 1 o 2 inauguraciones por mes de aquí en los próximos 2 años. Ahora, la verdad que el horizonte con el cual se está trabajando es el horizonte de objetivos que plantea la Ley 27191, que dice llegar al 20% al 2025. Eso es, yo diría, un gran paso, pero no va a ser suficiente. Ya hay que pensar cuál va a ser las metas, por ejemplo, para el año 2030. Ya tengo presentado un proyecto para que sea por lo menos un piso del 35%, pero cuando uno mira los escenarios para cumplir con los objetivos de París, deberíamos estar mucho más alto todavía. Hay la pregunta que surge y creo que es fundamental para sostener la idea de la transición es cómo vamos a acompañar, con qué menú de fuentes convencionales vamos a acompañar este desarrollo de las renovables. Digamos 20% de renovables y algunos están pensando que el otro 20% en materia de matriz eléctrica sea 20% hidroeléctrica y el 60% restante sea gas. Esto es más o menos el panorama que está teniendo el gobierno. No está pensando en tener gran desarrollo de petróleo, sino básicamente ir a una matriz eléctrica fuertemente basada en gas. Esto quiere decir que algunos debates que tenemos acerca de cuáles son las fuentes convencionales que pueden acompañar esto, primero que tenemos que clarificarlo, es decir, el rol que puede tener o no el gas, el rol que puede tener o no la hidroeléctrica, y si tiene allí algún rol las fuentes como los combustibles líquidos, o como puede ser el carbón, o como puede ser nuclear. Y ahí es donde yo digo lo de la diversificación. Ir hacia el gas implica que los lobbies que están haciendo para mantener vivo la componente nuclear, para mantener vivo una componente que puede crecer en carbón y en hidrocarburos líquidos, es muy fuerte. Lo vimos cuando el año pasado hubo que colocar un impuesto al dióxido de carbono de los combustibles fósiles, que prácticamente era simplemente un cambio de nomenclatura a un viejo impuesto. El lobby que hubo por parte del sector petrolero para que ese impuesto fuera más bajo o prácticamente no existiera, se logró, y prácticamente en la reforma impositiva que tuvimos el año pasado, el impuesto al carbono fue yo diría, una opción prácticamente simbólica. Digo, son peleas que se han dado en los últimos años y nos muestran que la transición energética no está del todo clara. La política prácticamente en ese momento, cuando se discutió el impuesto al carbono, se retiró por completo. Creo que el dilema energético acerca de cómo combinamos, con qué fuentes convencionales acompañamos el crecimiento de las renovables es parte sustancial. El otro componente que la política tiene que tener en cuenta y que para Argentina es tremendamente dramático en cuanto a transición es si vamos hacia ese objetivo de abandonar los combustibles fósiles en 30 años, en 30 años no solo hay que producir una transformación tecnológica en el sector energético, sino que hay que producir una transformación económica y social en vastas regiones de la Argentina. Y eso es tremendamente difícil y es para mí el mayor desafío que enfrenta la política. Piensen ustedes en enclaves como puede ser acá cerca, alrededor de la refinería de Ensenada, donde prácticamente toda una comunidad vive alrededor de la refinería de hidrocarburos de petróleo. Piensen en provincias como Neuquén, que dependen su economía totalmente del petróleo. Allí cuando las regalías bajan, no cobran los maestros. No existe más el Estado. Hola. Piensen en lo que es el Golfo de San Jorge, toda la zona de Comodoro Rivadavia. Es decir, son situaciones a las cuales la política tiene que atender. Yo creo que, como bien se mencionaba antes y se mostraba, creo que el desafío tecnológico no es el principal desafío que enfrentamos en la transición energética. El principal desafío que enfrenta la política es cómo hacemos esa transición justa y atendemos a los impactos sociales que esto va a significar. Vaca muerta es uno de los otros de los dilemas. Vaca muerta significa la posibilidad de bajar los niveles de importación de gas que hoy tiene Argentina, acompañar con una fuente flexible y de menores emisiones al desarrollo de las renovables, pero también la política ve allí una gran oportunidad para hacer grandes inversiones y tener allí un saldo exportable. Eso también tiene complejidad, porque las inversiones no se van a poder amortizar en el tiempo que eso va a tener como disponible para poder, si estamos pensando en 30 años, 2050, con 0 emisiones. Entonces, estos son algunos de los desafíos que la política tiene que resolver de aquí a tan solo 3 décadas. Yo dejo aquí y vamos a preguntas.
Muchas gracias, Juan Carlos. You mentioned the challenges in the transition, and obviously I would say that many of the challenges that you mentioned, especially with regard to the just transition, not just the technical transition, but also making the transition just one, is not just in Argentina, but is in many places. So how do we actually really make sure that it's with the people, not against the people? How do we ensure an inclusive approach for that? So before I hand over to you to ask your questions, just one question to the panel and maybe Steve, or maybe you would like to elaborate just quickly on this. Since the G20 is coming to Argentina, and since we established what we need to do, and that it's technically possible and feasible, but that we are lacking time. And now we have the 20 heads of state in Argentina speaking about sort of, all kinds of political aspects. What would be key thing that you would recommend, that you would ask the G20 to decide? I don't know, it's a little bit difficult question, I can imagine, but Steve already indicated, maybe you go first, Steve, and then Juan Carlos, you might follow up on that question. So what is our call to the G20 heads of state with regard to the transformation that we're discussing here?
They should unveil their plans to shut down all the coal-fired power stations in their countries by 2025 or 2030 at the latest. Because if they're not willing to do that, then this is all just words and nonsense.
I like that a lot because I'm coming from Germany, as you know, and in Germany this is a big debate.
It is a big debate, but if Germany can't even get it right, then we should all go sailing or something, because we're wasting our time here.
Thanks for that, Steve.
No pressure, no pressure.
No, but seriously, I mean, this of course would have to be the result of the decisions ultimately taken on the sort of multilateral level.
When has a multilateral decision ever had anything to do with that? All of the coal-fired power stations that have been shut down, that I know of, are as the result of domestic decisions, or local decisions even, and through public movements and pure economics. I wish it were not the case, and I wish there was some evidence that a multilateral institution had actually caused a coal-fired power plant to be shut down somewhere, but where would that be?
Don't get me wrong, I really enjoy this clear language we ultimately have to do. Juan Carlos?
Creo que dos cosas. En primer lugar, tienen que mostrar no una vocación, sino un compromiso serio con respecto al cumplimiento de los NDC que han tomado. Elevando la ambición, tiene que liderar esa discusión, porque hoy estamos en un póker donde cada uno está mirando qué hace el otro. El G20 tiene que ser quien lidere ese poner sobre la mesa las nuevas ambiciones y traccionar al resto del mundo. Y algo que es inevitable, tiene que aparecer la plata. Tiene que aparecer la plata. Creo que piensen esto que yo he comentado de Argentina replicado por cantidad de países en el mundo. Es decir, claramente tiene que haber dinero, flujo de dinero para poder cumplir con las metas condicionales y con más ambición. Pero creo que lo que tiene que salir es por parte de los países del G20 es nuevos compromisos dispuestos a hacerlos obligatorios y conducir este proceso de acá al 2020 para que todos podamos subir la ambición.
I think these are really important points that you made, and especially with regard to the fact that especially the financial track of the G20 is discussing, future investments into infrastructure, and infrastructure then, investment then determine the future for the next 3 or 4 decades. It is really important that that the lights are going to the right direction. So we have the first question from this gentleman over there, please.
Thank you. My question is for Steve Sawyer, and he started his presentation, thank you for your presentation, saying that in the climate negotiations there was nothing spoken about energy, and in the energy sector nothing was spoken about climate. And my question is, how do you have these two groups talking together? What resources do they need, and how we could help? Thank you.
I wish I had an answer to that question. I've been trying to solve it for 30 years. But I think the problem is when the climate, within the formal negotiations, they want to have a conversation about energy. They go through the normal channels, which means they go to the World Bank, who hires a consultant who went to school with the guy who's making the procurement thing and who works for one of the big fossil fuel funded consultancies in Washington, D.C., or in Berlin, or in New York, or in Sydney. And those are the guys that are brought in to manage the discussion. And they are representative of the largest vested interest in the history of the world, with the possible exception of the Catholic Church, who have an extraordinarily huge economic interest in maintaining the status quo and spinning this thing out for as long as they possibly can. So I don't know, but we've seen increasingly resistance against that from some of the parties. But I think within the G20, for instance, if those countries stood up on their hind legs and were saying we're not having any more fossil fuel lobbyists, I mean, think about it. The single major thing that we need to do to solve the climate issue is to stop emitting CO2. 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions, or 65 or whatever, come from burning fossil fuel in the energy sector. Yet, that is the main business grouping that is represented in the climate negotiations when they want to talk about how to put themselves out of business. I mean, seriously? But that's what happens. And I think for the energy side of things, it's more, there are periods in different countries where if you talk about climate, you're branded as a crazy lefty or something like that. I mean, there was a period in the Bush administration, for instance, in the US, which looks like the glorious past now, but at that time, my colleagues in the American Wind Energy Association were told, basically don't talk about carbon because it hurts you politically for many of the same reasons. But I think I spend a lot of my time, and I know Sven and others do, is forcing the energy guys who are actually doing basically mostly the right thing, the ones who are involved in wind and PV and others. And they're now getting a little bit braver about talking about climate, but they have to get a lot braver.
Sven, you want to follow up?
I just want to add one other aspect, and that's the just transition aspect. We see quite often that companies or the political talks about energy take the workers basically hostage to force them to demonstrate against sort of new development on renewables or stuff like that. So it's seen as this transition is actually just deliberately to destroy jobs. But this is not the case. And I think from being an academic and working at a university, I think what we actually have to do is we basically have to have a plan also in terms of education and training to actually start training engineers on renewables. When I studied engineering in the early 90s, I had to study nuclear engineering. And as voluntary in the afternoon, when everybody else had parties, I actually had solar and wind classes. And I actually thought that's something good. Turns out to be not too problematic now, but it's actually the transition, because if we start to train a worker now in coal power plants, this person will work there for 40 years and expect a job for 40 years. But if we see that many industries already have an average age of like 45 or 50, so we sometimes overlook that if we talk about phasing out oil, we're not talking about tomorrow. We are talking about 10, 15, 20 years. That means those people are already retired. We just have to stop training new people and basically train them to be unemployed. I think that's the smart part of a just transition.
Thank you. I think, John.
Just wanted to add very quickly that the best instrument that I have seen in terms of, I mean, people expect renewable energy to solve all the problems. It won't. It will make electricity with no CO2. Everything else is a bonus and you have to work for it. One of the best examples is the procurement program in South Africa, where they do a tender. 70% of it is on the price, but 30% of it is on a very specific South African set of social and political objectives having to do with black empowerment, local ownership, community investment in the projects, etc. Now, it's not perfect, and it hasn't worked perfectly, but it's worked pretty well, and that is a model that could be very usefully adapted and applied around the places. Have the governments build those objectives right into the procurement process from the beginning and not have them operate completely just on price, and you'll get a lot more social benefit, inclusion, empowerment, and spreading the money, which is what it's all about, built in from the get-go.
So I think, thanks for the question, and you got a very dense answer, I suppose, from all different levels. We have two more questions. This lady over there, I saw you, and this gentleman already.
Muchísimas gracias. Antes de hacer la pregunta, un pequeño recordatorio. Acá se mencionó mucho la palabra transición. Quiero recordar que en la última reunión de ministros del G20, hecha en la ciudad de Bariloche, se acordó modificar la palabra transición por transiciones. Transición fue en Alemania, hoy ya estamos hablando de transiciones, lo cual para mí es un cambio fundamental en todo esto, y ahora va a ir mi pregunta en esto. Dentro de la responsabilidad compartida y diferenciada, la pregunta es, dentro de estas transiciones que debe de haber de todos aquellos países que han firmado este acuerdo de París, ¿cuál sería la velocidad que debería de tener un país que tiene, digamos, $50.000 per cápita de Producto Bruto contra otro país que tiene $6.000 o $7.000 de PBI, ¿no es cierto?, per cápita? Es obvio que la diferencia es importante y las condiciones económico y sociales son muy diferenciadas en cada uno de ellos.
Thank you very much for the question. Sven already indicated to have a say on that. And then I come to you. Please take the chair, then later.
I would like to give an example. For example, when we do the energy scenarios right now, we work on scenarios for Africa and for Europe and for Australia and for Japan. And what we factor in is that the electricity demand per capita and per household, which is very different parameters, but per household will be on the same level around 2030, 2040. That means everyone has the same right for electricity. Right for development, we're not questioning the right for development. We're just questioning the right for pollution. And you don't have to pollute in order to be developed. Actually, the opposite is the case. Right now, solar and wind is not just cheaper, it's also quicker. Construction of a coal power plant, if everything runs well, is about 5 years. A wind farm, the construction is a few weeks or months, then depending of how long the permit process is, could be 6 months, could be 3 years or 4 years. So
10 years in the UK.
Sometimes 10 years. So that's basically the very important parameter. And secondly, on very specific question, for example, in our scenarios, we do not expect for Africa, for example, to expect to start with electric mobility, to have electric vehicles. That's very unlikely that they actually start with electric vehicles straight away, because that would basically kill the infrastructure at the very, very first moment. So we actually have an analysis of what's possible right now and just take it from there.
Excellent, thank you. Sven and Juan Carlos, you also wanted to add something.
Comentario sobre esto. Uno puede entender que hablemos de transiciones, porque claramente todos partimos de lugares distintos, matrices energéticas diferentes, entonces cada uno tiene un proceso particular de transición. Eso sería la interpretación, yo diría, benigna de esa idea de hablar de transiciones. Yo creo también que hay una componente de, en el corto plazo, no me compliquen la vida y yo hago lo que quiero, ¿sí? Creo que allí juegan también los lobbies, es decir, para que en el corto plazo yo estoy haciendo la transición, pero lo hago a mi manera. Entonces, no me hablen de carbón, no me hablen de nuclear, no me hablen de hidrocarburos. Es decir, cuidado que a veces encubre eso una idea de, bueno, en el corto plazo yo respondo a esta idea de diversificar. Entonces, yo ahí pongo una luz de alerta cuando me hablan de transiciones. La transición es claro a dónde tenemos que ir y por supuesto que cada uno parte de lugar distinto, por lo tanto el camino es diferente. Me parece que no haría falta aclararlo. A mí me preocupa a veces esa expresión.
Thanks.
Preocupa porque sé quiénes son los que la promueven.
Speaking about terminologies, it strikes me, for example, that terminologies really determine our thinking. And if we continue speaking about fossil fuels, just the terminology fossil fuels suggests that this is stuff that we need to burn. Huh? Oil needs to be burned because it's a fuel. No, it's not a fuel. It may be considered as a resource, or it may be considered as something else, but we are making it, by the terminologies, we're making it a fuel and think, okay, well, if we don't burn it, then it's useless or what? So, but over to you now the question, and then we close the panel, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Maru Carracedo. I'm from ADOS Global and the Youth 20 Engagement Group. And I want to thank the panel. Thank you, Sven, for mentioning education. That gives me something to talk about and ask you about. You talked about educated engineers in universities and how we need to start thinking about change in that matter. And my question is, we're talking about 4 decades ahead, and yet barely any of you mention youth in your allocations. So I think my question is, why do you think youth needs to be involved in the decision-making processes? How youth maybe needs to take part of this process? We're talking about, 4 decades ahead. You already said it. People in companies are 45, 50, 60 years old. Maybe that's an issue. Why is not youth involved in those decision-making processes? So that's my question for you.
Great question. Thank you very much, and thank you for daring taking the chair, by the way. It's our experiment here, whether this works, so at least once it worked. Steve, about education and training programs for renewables.
Well, that's one question, but the other question is about youth. I mean, the reason you need to be involved is you're going to inherit this mess. You already are in the process of inheriting this mess, and I apologize for the mess. We've done what we can, but it's nowhere near enough. I mean, my daughter's 30. She's now, after studying lots of other things, she's ended up in the renewable energy sector now, which is great. But again, we have, in the US for the wind sector, most of the wind development is in the Midwest, in the flyover states, from Texas to North Dakota. They didn't have any engineers locally. The wind companies found it in their vested interest to invest in training programs for electrical engineers in the community colleges, in the local state university or whatever. It's paid them back many, many times over. But they had to come up with it on their own there. In South Africa, this is part of the investment that the companies make as part of their bid, their tender bid, and I think that's a good way to incentivize it as well. Because without the engineers, you can't make it work. And it's always cheaper to hire a local engineer than it is to fly someone in from Europe or the US.
Sven?
I just don't want to repeat. My son has just started studying engineering, and I hope he will end up somewhere in the renewables sector as well, but maybe somewhere else. But what I think what's important is you need to be involved in the very beginning, because also the subjects and the kind of engineering will change. So for example, if we start to train an engineer right now, it takes 5 to 7 years till this engineer can actually start his first work. And that means that we are pretty much down the track already in our climate targets. So that means we actually really have to take the youth into account. And I just can say the same as Steve. Sorry, I tried to do my best in the last years, but we weren't good enough. We still have more emissions, because if I see my first scenario, we would have been on half of the emissions already. I know the first and last time I've been in Buenos Aires was with Juan Carlos, and I published an energy scenario for Argentina. We are sort of 9 years behind schedule, but it looks better now.
Okay, well, at least that's a good indication, that's a good sign. And Juan Carlos already mentioned that this time it really seems to be very serious, the development of renewable energy in Argentina, which is quite encouraging, I have to say. And it's also because of your work and
20 años
Sebastian
atrasado.
Kin's work and others. So, and on a positive note with regard to Use 20, I heard that if there's in the Use 20 sort of if there's a poll which are the most relevant subjects, it's always these subjects that are chosen as the key subjects from the Use 20, and that is actually a promising sign to me that from the youth the interest is really there to get engaged in this. We close this panel now, but not before asking one very final short question to all of you, with the idea to really respond to it in 20 seconds or in 10 seconds, really literally. And the last question is, we've heard a lot of sort of ideas about developing renewables and so on. What is the most relevant rate limiting factor for progress towards an energy transition? There are many things, many technical issues, but not really the technical challenge at all, but more the political challenge. But what is it really? What is the most important? Is there one thing that really still holds us back that we would like to remove? Who wants to start?
Fossil
Steve.
fuel lobby.
So the rate limiting factor is the fossil fuel lobby, or the lobby that burns fossil resources.
Tens of trillions of dollars of revenue a year.
Yeah.
Kyle, what is the most important factor?
Related, the flip side of that, subsidies.
Subsidies.
600 billion to a trillion, and in terms of youth, a youth movement to really finally expose to the light the perverse incentives that are funding what we all want to change.
Okay. Makes sense. Sven.
Inclusion of all genders and social groups and communities, because we need social acceptance for the power plants, which are coming close to the people.
That's right. Social acceptance for this transformation. Mika.
Yep. I said that non-state actors' action is quite important, but I still believe that the political will of the government is quite important, and I want to push that.
Para no repetir, me quedo con la última pregunta. Yo creo que acá hay muchas fundaciones, tienen que pensar cómo trabajar con la dirigencia política joven, con las juventudes que van a ser los dirigentes, los futuros gobernantes en 5, 10 años. Creo que allí hay una cantidad de gente que tiene que aprender y entender todo esto.
Excellent. I'd like to thank you for this excellent panel. Thank you very much for the good questions. Thank you for bearing with us, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you. Thank you.
Bueno, los invitamos a un almuerzo que va a concluir a las 2:15. Así que por favor, para las 2:15 estén de regreso acá. Muchas gracias.